If you don't wish to be recorded, you can click stop video to keep your camera off throughout the event. Auto-generated closed captions are also available for this event. You can click on the closed caption button on your Zoom menu bar to activate that. Sorry, I just got rid of my spiel. Zoom always wants to be in front. We'll be posting more helpful reminders in chat, including the NASW code of conduct, social media, and other info. If you have questions, please go ahead and post those in chat. Ideally, start it with a Q just to make it a little easier to identify the questions, because I'm sure we're going to have questions for Siri. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Siri Carpenter. Although I'm not sure I need to introduce her because most people are familiar with her nonprofit organization, the Open Notebook. Siri is the award-winning journalist and editor whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Science, Discover, Scientific America, and elsewhere. She is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit organization, the Open Notebook, and editor of the book, The Craft of Science Writing. She's been a member of the NASW since 1998, a volunteer in many NASW committees, and an NAS board member from 2016 to 2020. She has a PhD in psychology from Yale University and lives in Madison, Wisconsin. Okay, take it away, Siri.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Jennifer, Ellen in absentia, Kim. Thanks to the Freelance Committee for putting together these really great sessions and for inviting me to talk to you all today. I was asked to speak with you all about how writers and editors can have good relationships. And we're kind of talking about after a story is assigned. So we're not going to talk about the pitching process or the evaluation of pitches today, but kind of like you've assigned a story as an editor, you're a writer who has been assigned a story. What are some of the things that you can be thinking about in, trying to foster and sustain happy, healthy relationships with one another? I come to this conversation with having been on both sides of the aisle, as it were. I was a freelance science writer I had my first internship in 1998, and I was a freelancer starting in 2002, and I was a freelancer for many, many years, and then I became an editor. My first editing job was at Discover magazine, and I did that for a couple of years while I was also, it was the early days of the Open Notebook, so I was kind of learning to become an editor in both of those contexts. So at this point, I've been an editor for about 13, 14 years. I was also freelance writing and freelance editing for some years until about 2018, when the Open Notebook editing and running the Open Notebook became my full-time gig. So I like to think that I am, decent at being able to hold the perspective of editors and writers in mind, but I guess it's, not for me to judge whether I'm good at that. Excuse me. So today I'm going to start by, I've kind of broken down like things to be thinking about in editing and writing relationships by thinking about the editors first and then thinking about the writers. So if you're in the room and you're a writer and you're feeling like, wow, she's really piling on the editors here, and then the tables flip and you feel like, wow, she's really piling on the writers. A lot of these points are really a two-way street. There's kind of a flip side to each of these things. So with all of that as prelude, I'm just going to jump right in and start by giving some thoughts about what it means to be an editor and to be thinking about that relationship and trying to have a healthy relationship with the writers who you work with. The kind of number one thing I would say, and this is true for editors and writers equally, is to just kind of go into the whole thing with an assumption of good intent. Like your default belief should be that the person who you're working with has good intentions, even if you feel like they're screwing up, even if you're annoyed with them. Like all of those feelings are fine, but kind of trying to go in with a feeling of good intent, I think, in any relationship is important. I also feel like sometimes there can be this kind of feeling of tension or acrimony or resentment between freelancers and editors, and it's a difficult profession to be in, and I think it's important to remember that we are all part of the same ecosystem. And it's no surprise to any of you here, I'm sure, that journalism is in a lot of turmoil right now, and that's been true really for a long, long time. That was kind of one of the founding premises of the Open Notebook. And we're all part of that ecosystem. And a lot of times, everyone is just trying to do their best within an ecosystem, a journalism ecosystem, if you're within journalism, but it's equally true in other institutions, that has its own systemic issues that, you're trying to be a human being within. So I think just bearing all of that in mind as kind of a default framework for thinking about relationships is important. For editors, then, related to that, my first piece of advice is something that I think all of you probably naturally gravitate to, is to try to approach your work with your writers in a way that's compassionate and empathetic, and to remember that a big part of your job is to support the writer. So that means trying to keep your writer's perspective in mind throughout the process. If you're feeling frustrated with the process at any point, or you're wondering what is the reason for these delays, or why is this work not coming together more quickly than I would like, or something, to remember, they might have very little training or experience, but a lot of talent and motivation. They might be juggling multiple assignments for multiple outlets, and trying to keep it all together. They might be excited to be selling their first story to their dream publication, or they might be excited to be selling their first story, full stop. They might be desperate for the income that's coming from this work to keep food on the table, to support their families, and so on. So, just trying to, you don't always know what the perspective is of the writer. It's not your job to go in and ask them to fill out a survey about their personal life, but to kind of keep in mind that that perspective that the writer might be coming to the project with. At the same time, I would say that doesn't mean that you can't sometimes give difficult news, or some tough love when someone needs it, to better serve your readers, or to stay on deadline, or whatever is the case. Sometimes you do have to tell it like it is, but to do that in a way that comes from a place of compassion and empathy. In a more nuts and bolts kind of vein, probably the number one complaint that writers have is that it just takes forever to hear from editors, that sometimes they feel like their messages are just going into a void. They don't know what's going on. Edits take forever, that kind of stuff. Like, just, being on the outside of a publication when you're a freelancer, it can just feel like you're being ghosted, or you just don't know what's going on. So making it a priority to respond promptly to writers, even if it's to tell them no, or to tell them you need more time, or just to tell them you got the message, or you have to talk to so-and-so, or you're sick, or you're going on vacation, or your boss is on vacation, or whatever is the case. Prompt communication goes a long way toward, I think, helping writers feel like this is a relationship that is healthy and tolerable. Then when it comes to starting out the process of working on an actual story, I think having a really detailed assignment letter is super important. This is something that I have learned the hard way, because I've had times where somebody's pitched a story. I've felt like, that sounds great. I bet they're going to do great. Go, green light. And I haven't taken the time to spell out, like, this is what I hear you saying you're going to do. This is my vision for the story. I'd like you to consider these kinds of sources, like getting all of the details about what you're expecting out of the story into writing. And it could be that is done so thoroughly in a pitch that you don't need to, regurgitate it in an assignment letter, but just to have in writing that one way or another, this agreement that you have about what the story is going to be. And I say that not because you're going to want to have like legal backup, but because it helps everyone down the road if you have put into writing clear expectations for the story. It helps the writer to report the story and write it, especially at that moment where they've just interviewed 10 people. They've got 20 PDFs in front of them. They've just kind of lost the plot. Like they can't see the forest for the trees. If they can go back to an assignment letter that has enough detail, that's like a trail of breadcrumbs out of the forest. And then of course, if the writer files a story to you that's a very big departure from what you were expecting, you have something that you can fall back on and say, like, I still would like, I see that this is quite a bit different from what was assigned. We need to talk about it, or here's what I would still like to see, or whatever. So having a detailed assignment letter, I think, is a service to your writer, and your future self will thank you as well. During the process when the writer is reporting and writing their story, some writers will want to check in a lot. They might want to, work through challenges that they're having. They might want to ask you to take a look at an outline or whatever. Make yourself available for those things. And especially if it's a newer writer, to have the person make sure that they understand that they are welcome to do that. I remember when I was younger and I was starting out as a freelancer, I think I kind of had this idea that once I got an assignment, if the editor heard anything from me between the time of the assignment and the deadline, that was a sign that I needed too much handholding and I was a pain and they would never want to work with me again. And clearly I was too green and so on. And I just didn't take advantage of the resource that the editor was, because I just didn't know that it was okay to do that. So letting people know that it's okay to do that, I think, is a real service, because they just might not know that they can do that. If writers do send you reporting updates or outlines, you're busy and it can be really easy to just kind of like glance at it and kind of be like, sounds good, keep going. Like, I don't have to deal with this until your deadline. But I have fallen into that trap and then realized later, like, I didn't pay enough attention to the outline, or I didn't pay enough attention to the reporting update. And there was a red flag in there. There was something that was going to end up happening in the draft that I was going to not be happy with. And I could have kept that from happening if I had just paid closer attention at that time. So disciplining yourself to take the moment to think, to focus on that story and respond to those things thoughtfully, and to be thinking, imagine yourself editing the story that comes out of that outline. If the outline looks all wrong, do your future self. I feel like I spend a lot of time thinking about my future self. Do your future self a favor and pay attention to those things if the writer does send them to you. It might be the case that you specifically want to ask for an outline, or you want to specifically ask for updates along the way. If there's any reason why you feel a little uncertain about whether the writer is going to need that support, if they're brand new, or if they're just pretty new, or they're just new to you, or it's a particularly tricky topic, or there was anything in the process of assigning the story that left you with, like a little seed of doubt about whether things were going to be on the right track. Just ask that person. Don't just like welcome an outline, but you can ask for an outline. And it's very rarely the case that someone's going to be like, God, I wish I never would have written an outline and run it by my editor. Like, it is a service to everyone to go through that process. Certainly there are times where I don't think you need to ask for an outline. I've certainly had plenty of writers that I've worked with that I would just feel like they'll let me know if they need me to look at an outline, but I've worked with them a lot. I know that they have that confidence, and I don't have to worry about it. Now I want to talk a little bit about the actual editing process. Like, a draft comes into your inbox, and if you are a working editor, you've probably had the experience of, like, a draft comes in and like it's your whole job to edit that thing, but you just feel this sense of dread. Like, as long as you don't open it, you don't have to find out if the story is going to be a huge problem for you, or really difficult, or maybe you don't feel like you're up for the challenge of editing it if it's just sitting in your inbox. But like, our job is to actually edit the stories that we've assigned and not just let them sit in our inboxes. So when I was starting out, I felt that sense of dread all the time, and it was not so much tied to was the writer's work good? It was tied to, do I know how to edit this story? Do I understand how to approach the editing task? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, how do I become a better editor, and how do I get past that point of feeling like, I see a story and I'm like, oh, this is not good. I think the next draft should be good. that's not helpful. Like, how do I figure out how to get past that? So I've thought about the things that you can be looking at and the process that you can go through to maximize the chances that you're going to be able to actually edit the story effectively. So we have like a whole series of editing workshops at the Open Notebook that go into this in great length. And I am already over time in talking about editors here, so I'm not going to go into that detail. But the main things I want to say about the process of editing a draft is, first of all, I really, really, really encourage you to read the story first, the whole story, before you type anything. Like, sit on your hands, print it out, take it across the room with no pen, whatever you need to do to just make yourself sit and read it. And I say that very humbly because I find that really, really hard to do. I tend to think with my fingers and I want to go into a draft and just start fixing sentences and so on. But I know that that's not good when I do that because I'm thinking at the wrong level about that story. What I think you need to do is to think about the story holistically, to think about not just what's there, but what's not there, and to think about it at the level of like conceptual issues and structural issues, and not at the level of style and sentences. And that's just really hard to do if you're typing along or writing along in the margins. So, giving yourself the time to think at that bigger, more holistic level is probably my biggest piece of advice in the editing process. When it comes to actually communicating your edits, a few key things that I would say is I love a good top note, like something that just kind of like thematically brings together the edits and communicates what my top priorities are and communicates what I think is good about the story in a genuine way, not like just the like, oh, you're supposed to do the praise sandwich, but like everybody needs to know that you didn't just hate every single thing about their story before you dump a bunch of edits on them. And so thinking about like, what do you genuinely appreciate about the story? Maybe the reporting is really deep, or the quotes are fantastic, or they were just like super dogged in pursuing some information that didn't want to be found, or the writing is really beautiful, or whatever is, the lead is great, whatever is the case, like mention a few of those things that you genuinely like. It's for your benefit as you're thinking about the story. It's for the writer's benefit so that they can keep tabs on the fact that there are things about this story that are good, and it needs editing because everything needs editing. We all need editing. Every writer needs editing. One of my big things is I really advise to try to not ever use the word but in an edit. So it can be tempting to say like, I like this and this and this about your story, but it's really disorganized, but it doesn't have any transitions or whatever. Like I tend to like type that and then take it out. I edit my own top note to take that out and then reframe it as like, here are the things that I like. For the next draft, I'd like to focus on such and such. And like, to me, it's not just semantic. It's really saying like, there's going to be a next draft. There's always a next draft. And this is what I'd like to focus on. But now like, we're a team here. It's not like you against me. Like, I'm going to help you. We're going to work together to figure out how to solve the things that need to be solved. I might not know all the answers, but we're a team. We've got each other now. And the final thing I think I'll say, and then I'm going to, there's so many other things to say about editing, but I'm going to just say, watch out for scope creep. Probably, everyone in the room has heard this concept of scope creep, where the writer is suddenly being asked to do a lot of things for the story that don't seem like they were part of the original assignment because the editor just cooked them up in their head as they were editing. Ooh, it'd be nice if this story also did such and such and such and such. And suddenly the story is 50% longer. The writer may or may not be getting paid 50% more, but in any case, it's not what they were expecting to do. It's easy to introduce scope creep into your editing process because you can always think of ways that stories would be even cooler than you imagined at the point when you were assigning them. But it is something to watch out for in yourself. And I'm going to come back to talking about scope creep later from the writer's perspective as well. And if we run out of time before the Q&A, then please remind me because I do think it's important. So now I'm going to flip a little bit. Jennifer, I'm sorry. I know you said try to keep it to about 25 minutes, and
well, let me ask you a question. Do you want? There's a few questions in chat. Do you want to address the questions related to what you just talked about before you do the shift?
Why don't I do the shift? Because it could be that it'll answer some of those questions. Okay. I haven't looked at them, but it might. But also, I just want to make sure that I don't shortchange the writers in the group who might be a larger number of the group, a larger number of people here. So advice for writers. And this is both from my perspective as a writer and also from my perspective as an editor who edits writers. My first piece of advice is to read your assignment letters. You would be surprised how often it's the case that as an editor, I've written I feel like a really super helpful, detailed assignment letter. And then the story I get back just seems to have ignored a whole bunch of the major things that were in that assignment letter. And that's really frustrating because not just because like, oh, I put a lot of work into that assignment letter, but because then I have a story that is going to be more work for everyone. And the writer might have put in a lot of time and effort into doing something that was not part of the assignment and not done the parts of the assignment that, that are still essential to do. So read your assignment letter and, do your best to do what was asked of you or what you agreed on at the time of the assignment, or have a conversation with the editor along the way. If you disagree with something, or if your reporting turns up something that makes you think like, I think we need to have a little bit of a different focus here or whatever, have that conversation with the editor. Editors do not like to be surprised. So don't spring a surprise like it's a totally different story than you expected on the editor at the time of deadline. And this leads into a more general point that I think is probably the number one thing that all editors would say. In fact, I know it is because I've surveyed editors about this, and that is to communicate. It can be really tempting if things are going kind of poorly with your story to feel like in your worry, you just want to kind of hide away and stick your head in the sand and hope that things turn out and your editor never has to know how poorly things were going, or you're running behind, but somehow you had 2 months to work on a story, but you magically think you're going to be able to draft it in 2.5 hours on the day it's due or something. Don't do those things. Like editors can usually, not always, but editors can usually work around delays and other problems if they know about them. But there is maybe nothing more frustrating to an editor than having the deadline day come and then getting a request for an extension on that day. Like a request for an extension on the deadline day is missing a deadline. That's not, unless you're talking about something that has, 2 hours turnaround and you're asking for 3 hours turnaround or something, but you communicate as early as possible about any problems that you're having, whether it's something isn't coming together with the story, it's not shaping up in the way that you expected, you're just having trouble getting it done, you're having, you could be having health issues or family issues or any number of things going on that are causing issues, or your sources aren't getting back to you, or any, there could be any number of things that are going wrong. Communicate with your editor about that. And again, just like don't spring surprises on them, because it's so hard to deal with those situations once the deadline is there. Depending on the publication, often things move really fast once they get into editing. And if the editor only finds out on that day that actually we don't even have a story to move fast on, then that can create a real problem. And it can affect a whole lot of people. Even at the Open Notebook, where we move quite slowly over months with our stories, but ultimately there's the writer, there's an editor, there's a top editor, there's a fact checker, there's a copy editor, there may be a translations team, there's a production person. If we need a legal review, there could be a legal person like on standby to review a story. So there could be, anywhere from like 5 to 7 or 8 people who are affected by delays. So we just really want to know about them as early as possible. Another piece of advice that I have for writers is at the point when you're getting an assignment, if you're not already familiar with the outlet, ask the editor to explain to you, if they haven't proactively done so, what the editorial process is like at that publication. How many editors will probably see the piece? Will there be copy editors, sub-editors, fact checking? Are you going to need to annotate the story for fact checking? Are you going to need to fact check it yourself? Do you need to be looking for art ideas, or participating in the heads and the headlines, or writing decks, captions, anything like that? Like anything you can learn early on about what your role is expected to be in the process helps you to plan and then not feel annoyed or surprised when you're asked to annotate a story for fact checking or whatever. I didn't say this to the editors, but the flip side of that, of course, is communicate those things. Like have it in your writer's guidelines about what the process is going to be, so that people understand, so that writers understand what that's going to be. Let's see. File your stories on time. Coming back to that idea, just again to communicate it as early as possible, and to not consider asking for if you ask for an extension on the day that the story is due, that's missing your deadline without communication. So really avoid doing that. And no, like people ask for extensions all the time. Like in an ideal world, none of us would have to, but it's many things can interfere with getting a story done on time. So it's not uncommon for writers to ask for extensions, but the earlier you can do it, the better. I know maybe I'm hammering that too heavily, but it's like, I think editors would feel like it's the number one thing that they want to hear is communication. Make the first draft as good as it can be. And that might sound really obvious, like, what am I going to do? Make it the worst it can be. But I think sometimes people feel like if they can just get it out the door as quickly as possible, then, especially as a freelancer where it's such a struggle to survive financially, like the fastest way to move along is to get this thing into the editor's hands. And I think that it's a trap. I think it feels, and for a minute, it feels great because it's off your plate right now and you can focus on other things that will earn you some more income. But I think it causes a lot of problems when drafts come in that really need a lot of TLC. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but if you file a story that isn't your best work, which isn't to say it has to be perfect. No story is perfect, but that isn't your best work, then if it needs a lot of TLC to get even a first edit ready, that can delay the editing process on your, for you getting the edits. And, a lot of times writers feel like, oh, why are these edits so slow? And sometimes the reason is because they're really hard, because the story needed a lot of help. And sometimes that can be avoided, sometimes it can't. And sometimes the edits are slow for other reasons that don't have anything to do with you, the writer. It's that the editors were short-staffed, or there were other problems going on, or whatever. And that's not to say that slow edits are always like they come back to being the writer's fault. But the more that you can file stories that are as close as good as you can make them, like if you're thinking like, what would I feel like if this story got published tomorrow without any editing? The better you can make it when you file it, the more smoothly the editing process is going to go. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. That's not to say only file perfect drafts. There's no such thing. Normally expect multiple rounds of edits. Sometimes I've talked with newer writers who are like, I filed the story and I got edits back and I sent them. So that's done. And then they've been surprised to learn that there can be further edits. And so it's super common that there can be 2 or 3 or 4, or even more rounds of edits, depending on the complexity of the story, the quality that it was in when it was, the shape that it was in when it was turned in, and so on. And then the final thing I wanted to say, I said that I would come back to talking about scope creep. And that is to say that sometimes scope creep does happen. Like I said, sometimes editors, we have this temptation to just kind of keep adding elements to the story and asking for more than can fit into the space of a story. But sometimes I believe what the writer thinks is scope creep is not actually scope creep. It's part and parcel of the original assignment. And the writer may have lost track of what would constitute part of that original assignment, like what's kind of a to be expected scope of doing that original assignment. And sometimes when you're revising a story, it grows longer too. And so you feel like, oh, it was assigned at 1,200 words. My initial draft was 1,200 words. Now my, second draft or third draft is 2,000 words. That's scope creep. It's not always scope creep. Sometimes it's just that the story needs to be squished down and edited back into that, size, and it tightened up, but it's not actually that the scope of the story has increased. So I would just say, like, be mindful when you're thinking about whether what you're experiencing is scope creep or not. So I'm going to stop now and just let us go to chatting, because I feel like I've talked at you for plenty long. So Jennifer, would you, I haven't been looking at the chat. I do
Yeah,
have 17 things
I'll
in the chat.
manage the questions.
Great.
So the first question I didn't quite understand, so I'll read part of it, but feel free to unmute and qualify. It says, I think my biggest problem as a writer is that my editors are not willing to do the work to help me get my pieces published. I've been dropped by multiple publications this way. Any tips to avoid this from happening? So I'm not quite sure what is this like stories being killed or what? So I'm not, does Shiva want to
Yeah,
qualify?
hi. Actually, so I had my specific examples. I had a piece accepted to NPR Shots blog during the pandemic, and my editor was working 12-hour days, and I felt really bad for her. And she wasn't able to edit my story. It was quite long. It was through NPR SciCommers, now BU SciCommers, and
Right.
it ended up getting pulled because it was too much work to do at that time. And that's happened to me. That was the one example. It's happened to me again. And editors kind of just like, I feel like they just give up on my writing. So then my question is, am I like somehow subconsciously like influenced, like making editors' jobs more hard? Because I don't want to do that, but I just feel like I just can't get my pieces published. The really nice pieces that I do deep reporting, like I did over 40 hours of reporting for that NPR story, and I published it elsewhere, but I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, that's kind of a heart-wrenching situation to be in, where you feel like you've poured all of this heart and work into something, and it's just somehow not working for the editor, and you may or may not know why that is. And I really sympathize with that, because all of us, it's like, if you can give people feedback that's honest, it doesn't need to be like brutal, but is kind of kind but direct and specific, then that's a gift, to give feedback to a writer. And I haven't seen your stories, so I don't know what might have happened there, but I think some outlets have more bandwidth for taking time to really work with writers through multiple drafts, or to kind of take on a mentoring role, and other outlets just don't have that. And it sounds like that editor might have been in a situation where maybe temperamentally they really would have loved to do that, but they just knew that they couldn't. The demands of their job were too much for that. I'm really glad to hear that you were able to publish the story elsewhere. What I would say is something that you can do, and it's perfectly fine for writers to do this, is to go back to editors after everything is said and done and say, like, I'm looking for ways to improve my skills. And, since we've worked together, I was hoping that you might be willing to give me a little bit of feedback about, like one or two areas where you think I might want to particularly focus on. So kind of frame that conversation as like, I assume I need to improve my skills. You don't want to go and say like, what did I do wrong? But rather, like, we all need to improve our skills. I could use your perspective on what you think I might want to focus on. And it could be that the editor will say like, I would really focus on, I'm making this up, I haven't seen your story, of course, but the editor might say, maybe focus on making sure that you really understand what the central point of the story is, or maybe focus on getting quotes that are really illuminating, or focus on writing in a more direct, less academic way. Like, who knows what they might say. But if you go and you just kind of ask after the fact, so you're not saying like, you're not in the like kind of immediate rush to get a certain story published, but it's soon enough afterwards that they can remember. Just ask them for a quick little bit of feedback. Don't expect them to engage in 10 rounds of back and forth with you, but if they can send you a quick email that just points you toward a couple of things, and maybe if they can give you an example or two from that story, if one comes to mind, you're not asking them to go back in and like re-edit the story. That the whole point was they didn't have time to edit it. But that would be my suggestion, is if you find that this keeps happening, just seek out feedback. Editors are usually happy to give feedback, especially I think if it's framed in this way of not like, did I do something wrong? But rather framed in a like, I'm looking to improve, and I'd love your perspective on how I could do that. And you're, going to keep it brief.
Okay, the next question says, I'm an English tutor and I often open papers and read them and find them terrible. They're not what I would have written. Then when I reread them, they're actually great. How do writers cultivate that editor's sense that even if unconventional piece is great?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think it's one of the reasons that I say, like, when you read something, don't just start typing into it right away, is that I think it's really easy, at least it is for me, and I think for a lot of people, to have this temptation to just start rewriting things the way we would write them. And in our, in our own voice, with our own kind of default structure in mind. But if you can read something and kind of take it in and think about, like, what are the big conceptual ideas here? Do I agree that they're important or interesting ideas? Are they being unspooled in a way that is, logical, that is easy to follow, that's interesting, all of those things? Then you're probably going to have more of a tolerance for working in different story forms, where you'll go like, wow, this is a lot different than anything else. And of course, some of that is in the execution. Sometimes a writer might come and have some like really cool ideas, that it's a little hard to discern what the ideas are or how they all fit together, because if it's just a little messy, then it can just be hard to make sense of that. And as an editor, you kind of have to strike this balance between having that open-mindedness toward the idea that there's something cool in there that you are going to be able to help shape. It's not there yet, but you hope that you're going to be able to help shape it. Versus feeling like this is just, it's more work than I am up for. Maybe I don't know how to do it. Maybe I just don't have time to do it. Maybe I don't have the confidence that they're really, I can't quite tell if there's really something there. But I think starting as an editor, starting from just trying to read and think about the thing without putting on your line editor's hat is a really key aspect of that.
Okay, the next question is, how should you handle having trouble getting a hold of sources? I know to communicate with the editor in advance, but should you ask your editor for more context? Should you go research on your own? I'm in this situation now, and it's a challenge. She's dealing with a large institution, with lots of internal politics, and she doesn't want to go off track by getting completely new sources and surprising the editor, which you say is a bad thing.
Yeah, no surprises. Like, when in doubt, ask your editor. It's like, it depends on your circumstances, whether you can just go off looking for your own sources, or whether you're in a situation where the editor, for some, like if it's an institutional situation, they might particularly want certain people to be featured, and you have to like keep doggedly working extra hard to get those people. So, there's no one right answer to what you should do there, but except that I would say the right answer is never be afraid to ask your editor if you're unsure. It's often the case, I have noticed, that people today are more reluctant to make a phone call than used to be the case. And I think sometimes it doesn't occur to people, like, if no one's responding to my emails, there are still telephones. And like, yes, we all like are, not all of us, but many people are less comfortable on phones than used to be the case. But if you're in a situation where you really need to include someone and they're just not getting back to you or not replying to emails, then I do think that it's time to start making phone calls. And you can call, their number. You can call, if it's like within a university department, you can call the department secretary or whatever. You can call a public information officer. I'm not sure if you're in a public information office or if you're a journalist working, reporting on a university, but, call on everyone who might be able to influence that person to get back in touch with you. If it's the case that you're reporting on like a new study, and the researcher who's, like the lead researcher or the person who's deemed to be, or designated as the one to communicate, they're not getting back to you, definitely lean on the PIOs at their institution to shake the tree and get them to respond, because that's what they're supposed to do. That if there's doing a study that's been press released by their institution, then that's kind of part of the game, is that they need to be available for interviews.
Yeah, connected with that, I do mostly medical, and doctors are bad about responding to things.
Yeah.
I seem to have a lot more success when I CC whoever their admin is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or a department, a department admin. So suddenly, like, they respond within, a
Yeah.
couple hours.
Yeah. Like you don't want to be a jerk about it, but being persistent is part of the job. And, you might annoy them because you just won't stop getting in touch with them, but that is the job. So you don't have to feel like, oh, I don't want to ever annoy anyone.
Yeah.
Probably will if you're going to be a reporter.
So I have a question for you, Siri. You've already touched on some of this, but I just kind of, given that this is a this is a business chat funded by or supported, sponsored by NASW freelancers. How can editors effectively pay freelancers more without increasing their budget? Like, one of the things is you talked about being very specific about the assignments so they don't spend a whole bunch of time reporting on a story that isn't the story that you want. But are there other ways?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think like freelancer, it's so hard to make a living as a freelancer. And so anything that you can do that makes life easier for freelancers is great. So certainly just like having really clear assignments with, as much detail as you can provide short of being insulting to that person is great. The other thing is you can think about, you might be in a situation where you can't offer a higher rate, like a higher per word rate, but you can scale down the story. If you're in a position where you can pay, let's say you can pay, $500 for a story, like it's a kind of a lower paying outlet, but you normally ask for 1,000 words for that amount. Maybe what you can do is be asking writers for a 750 word story instead of 1,000 word story, so that you're just asking them to scale back the scope of what they're doing for the same amount of money. And you, like, as an editor, you may or may not be in a position where you have the authority to do that. Sometimes you can toss extra opportunities for money at freelancers, like if they do photography and they might have photos to sell, or if they are like visuals people and they can create visuals for you and you can also commission that. Or there's a sidebar that you'd like to do and that can be considered a separate story and get an additional fee. There's like some places, there's little tricks for ways that you can get people a little more money, and some of them sort of feel like they amount to like tricking the accountants. And if you got to trick accountants, you got to do what you got to do. I'm married to an accountant, so I would say, though, like short of the sort of like trick the system kinds of things that editors may or may not be able to do at a given place, the biggest thing that you can do is, really what matters to freelancers is how much they're making per hour, even though the rates typically are expressed in how much are they making by the word. If you can try to keep out of a situation where they're having to do, 6 rounds of revisions because of you, then that's great. Sometimes you have to do 6 rounds of revisions because the story keeps not getting better, but sometimes you don't. There's also the topic of killing stories, and it's painful to kill a story. Obviously it's painful for writers to have a story killed. It's also very painful for editors to feel like that's the only choice that they have is to do it. But I do think that there are times when it is like a kindness to everyone to kill a story, even though it feels like a waste of money. It means the writer can, hopefully you have a decent kill policy, and those vary. Like at the Open Notebook, we almost always pay a full fee when we kill a story, because our philosophy is like, if we assigned this story and it didn't work out, like that's on us. As long as the writer like filed the story and went through at least 1 round of revisions, then we'll pay the full fee. Sometimes we don't figure out until a few rounds in that it's just not going to get there. It's, I find it very hard to tell sometimes, because we really want to give writers every chance to be able to, solve the issues in their stories. But anyway, if you are at publication that pays a kill fee, there can be times where the best thing you can do for the writer is to kill the story, pay them the kill fee, and they can take it and try to sell it somewhere else, rather than like torturing them through tons and tons of more editing. So even though, it's unfortunate when stories are killed, I think it's inevitable that sometimes that happens. Sometimes things just don't work out as planned. And the best thing from the writer's financial perspective is to have the story killed if they get a kill fee at all. And, the bigger the better, and then be able to move on to pitch it somewhere else or just move on to something different.
What is your opinion if the writer suggests killing? I mean, I was in a situation, one of my early stories when I was doing journalism, and I was working with a brand new editor that I don't think had ever edited anybody. And it was just them trying to turn the story into how they would write it.
Yeah.
And we were just going in circles. Like, she would ask for one thing, and then it was like,
Yeah.
give her that. And then she'd ask for something different. And
Yeah.
And I finally just was like, I don't want to byline this with you. I'd like to just kill the story.
Yeah.
I was debating whether I could say that, because this is just not working.
Yeah. And I think it's the case that most, like, at least traditionally, most places would consider like that's the writer withdrawing from the story. It's not, it's not the publication killing the story. And yet you're talking about a situation where you feel like the story needs to be killed, and it does have to do with what's going on at the publication. It doesn't have to do with, you just having decided you didn't want to do the assignment. And I think it's totally fair to ask. I mean, all these things that I say, ask this, I just, you obviously would do this, to just ask in a way that's, like calm and respectful and all of that, and not like a, sort of fighting stance right off the bat. But to in a circumstance like that, I might say, like, it seems like this story isn't working out. I feel that I'm fulfilling, I've fulfilled my side of the assignment here. Please tell me if you think that's not the case. And this is where, like, having a good written assignment is helpful to everyone. Please tell me if you think that's not the case. But I wonder if you would like to consider killing this story and giving me a kill fee now, and just, consider that this is part of the cost of doing business. This is one of those stories that didn't work out. It's tricky because there are certainly times when writers, they feel like they're being asked to go around in circles, but the editor feels like the writer just isn't getting it. And like, who's to say who's right there? But I think it's reasonable in certain kinds of circumstances to ask. But I think most often, if a writer decides that they, are just not up for working on the story any longer for whatever reason, then they're probably going to be out the fee.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up, at the time it was frightening because I was pretty new, but it was one of those cases where a different editor had made the assignment, and then this new editor had become the editor. So maybe it wasn't really even a story that she thought should have been assigned, like.
Right. Yeah.
And I ended up suggesting we kill it, and it ended up going back to an earlier draft and getting published.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So
all manner of things happen.
Lead editor somehow got involved, and it just went back to like, at that point, it was just like, my hourly wage is not existent. I just want this to go away.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I just want this out of my life. Yeah. And, I think, like, all editors are new at editing at some point. And so, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest, like, editors always know best. Like, editors bring a lot of virtues to the process, one of which is distance from the reporting. It's sometimes easier to see things more clearly. If they've been, if they've done a lot of editing, they have all of that experience to draw on. But there are certainly times where we just do kind of a bad job editing, especially if it's one of those situations where we just started typing before we started really deeply considering the story, and we're sort of like mucking around in the draft as a way to try to figure out what it needs. Like, that's something to, coming back to what editors should do, that's something that editors really need to avoid, is sort of like, it's fine to muck around in the draft before sending it to a writer, as long as what you ultimately are sending them is something that's actually useful and helpful, and not just your attempt at trying to figure out how you might, let's just try this.
Okay, so let's stop recording because I always like to give a little bit of time to ask